For sure, yeah, we just had said they're probably gonna get moved. I was like,
Okay.
but they kept saying like we didn't like do it on that one. Like maybe a question or two, but it wasn't like the whole thing again.
All right, so we've got some stuff to cover
Let's do it all the time
today. So here's the game plan. Basically today we're going to talk about American neutrality and U.S. entering the war. Wednesday is UIL, so I will be here. I do have a web quest that I shared with you that you can work on Wednesday or anytime really between now and whenever. So you have that coming up. I've moved Reflection 3 back to April 14th to make sure that we have plenty of time. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing going on. So if you scroll down, the web quest is due April 1st. And that one's pretty simple. It is simply this. I'm going to have you guys kind of do some I'll kind of go through a quick timeline of the battles, but this will kind of get you to kind of look at some of the stuff about the battles. You can work on it in pairs, trios, something like that.
Is this one of those things where if you work hard, you'll be able to get it done in 30 minutes, or is it like a...
If you divide it into 3 people, there's 12 of them. 30 minutes, close, maybe not quite, certainly an hour, I would think. Yeah, it shouldn't take too long. And then you have, I'll have a World War II question that'll release on Friday after we get through kind of talking about all this. So that's pretty much it.
On the web quest, what does the theater mean?
Means which area of the world. I'll explain it, but there's Pacific Theater and Atlantic Theater. So anyways, I'm going to start by having us look at a map. Now this is just a map of Europe.
The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. Jews were the primary victims. 6 million were murdered. Roma, Gypsies, physically and mentally disabled people, and Poles were also targeted for destruction or decimation for racial, ethnic, or national reasons. Millions more, including homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, also suffered grievous oppression and death under Nazi tyranny. The Nazi Party came to power in Germany in 1933. The Nazis believed that Germans were members of a biologically superior race, threatened with extinction through the struggle for survival with inferior races. They saw Jews especially as a biological threat to the German Aryan race. Adolf Hitler moved to extend German power in Central Europe, annexing Austria and destroying Czechoslovakia in 1938 to 1939. In the aftermath of the violence of the Kristallnacht pogroms, the Nazis instituted the first systematic roundups of German and Austrian Jews. They deported approximately 30,000 Jewish men to Dachau and other concentration camps after Kristallnacht. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, beginning World War II. Within weeks, the Polish army was defeated. Britain and France declared war on Germany in support of Poland. Under a secret pact with Germany, Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland in 1939, but remained officially neutral in the war until 1941. The Germans killed or resettled hundreds of thousands of Poles in an effort to create new living space for the superior Germanic race. German families settled on the vacant properties. German authorities forced the Jewish population into ghettos, areas of cities where the Jews lived in horrendous squalor under German supervision. During the next 2 years, German forces were victorious, invading Denmark and Norway, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and France. As German troops neared Paris in June 1940, Italy, Germany's Axis partner, declared war on Britain and France. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union attacked Finland annexed 2 eastern border provinces from Romania, and occupied the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and later Finland and Croatia allied with Germany. In spring 1941, the Axis allies dismembered Yugoslavia and occupied Greece. In June 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union. German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory. This battle was also an ideological battle. Following German combat units, mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, German order police battalions, and other SS units supported by units of the German army slaughtered Jews and other victims in mass shootings. They killed more than 1.5 million Jewish men, women, and children in mass shootings. German police and military authorities also killed Jews in mass shooting operations in occupied Yugoslavia and eastern Poland. Increasing Soviet resistance halted the German advance, preventing the Germans from capturing the key cities of Leningrad and Moscow. A second German offensive in the summer of 1942 brought German forces deeper into Soviet territory, to the southeast, to the Volga River, and into the North Caucasus region. As the German advance stalled in the east, Germany moved to consolidate its dominance in Europe. They also extended in 1942 the systematic killing of Jews to other territories they controlled or occupied. German SS and police officials established killing centers in German-occupied Poland, where the Jewish population was both relatively numerous and densely settled. They deported Jews there, primarily by rail, from all over German-occupied Europe. Carbon monoxide gas, or Zyklon B gas, hydrogen cyanide, were the primary methods of murder. In late 1942 and early 1943, Soviet forces counterattacked and began liberating territory from German domination. In the west, Allied forces invaded Sicily and the Italian mainland that summer. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in northern France, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Meanwhile, from the east, Soviet forces reached Germany's eastern borders. As the Allies forced German troops to retreat, Allied troops began to encounter tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. In an effort to prevent large numbers of prisoners from falling into the hands of the Allies, the Germans forced the evacuation of many camps, compelling thousands of prisoners to march into the interior of Germany. Prisoners called these forced marches death marches. By the spring of 1945, conditions in the remaining concentration camps exacted a terrible toll in human lives. Overcrowded, filthy, with few supplies, these camps became sites of mass death. Around half of the concentration camp population in January 1945 died before the war's end. World War II ended in Europe with the unconditional surrender of German armed forces in May 1945. In addition to millions of other victims, Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered close to 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe. Hundreds of Jewish communities in Europe, some centuries old, disappeared forever in the massive crime we now call the Holocaust.
Okay, so that does a really good job of kind of giving you this sort of overview. And I'm going to move really, really quickly. Now, we talked last class a little bit about the differences between communism and fascism. That's that when the video talks about it being an ideological battle in Europe, that's what they're referring to, okay? Now, I want to point out that is only what we call the European theater. In other words, that's only this part of World War II, right? There is a Pacific theater, which happens over here, okay? Now, you still have an ideological conflict because Soviet Union, Russia, extends all across this. Here's Japan, right? Right next to what was the Soviet Union is now Russia. And Japan is considered to be fascist in the sense that they have a military, they believe in territorial acquisition. Individuals subsume who they are to serve the state, right? To serve the nationality. Usually embodied in the figure of a single person. Now, in Japan, it's kind of sort of a single person, and the emperor was pretty powerful, but the military kind of is a co-equal branch with the emperor. Now, obviously, in Italy, in Germany, that's not the case, right? The Fuhrer, Il Duce, Mussolini, Hitler, they're the main ones. And it's not just, when we say it's an ideological battle, it's an ideological struggle between totalitarian regimes. So total control. So, and the only reason I stopped to really kind of pause and explain a little bit about communism is because this sets us up for the Cold War that will come after, right? One of the reasons why, when we talk about the death of millions and millions of people, we focus very heavily on the Holocaust and what happens with the Jewish peoples in Europe is, in part, I would suggest to you, that after we defeat Japan, we want to maintain Japan to keep a close eye on the Soviet Union, right? In addition, we will create Israel by fiat in the Middle East to create a homeland for the European Jews. So there's some geopolitical ramifications to World War II that cause us to remember the history in a particular way. I can tell you that part of what we don't talk about part of why our history of the Soviet Union is a little fuzzy is because we have that Red Scare. Then all of a sudden, World War II, they're our ally, right? And we're on the same side, and we think that that's great. Yeah, sure. There should be plenty. That we basically say, they're our allies, so we're on the same side. Well, then all of a sudden, we're in a Cold War with them, right? So we don't really document in the 1930s while we're being isolationist, and then when the Soviet Union's becoming our ally, the extent to which Stalin is killing his own people. Millions and millions of his own people and his own collectivization, starving people, all that kind of things. Giving, really kind of what historians and political scientists would argue is Stalinist communism, which has its own unique kind of flavor that differs from the Marxist communism or the Lenin communism or the communism that even follows with Khrushchev after Stalin dies. So you've got a series of totalitarian regimes taking over. And I kind of made this point towards the end of last week's classes, that the United States is kind of, in its own way, expanding government control real extensively, right? I mean, we've had the New Deal and all that kind of, all that sort of development that's been happening. So without going too much, since we're not world history, we don't have to know a whole lot about how Hitler comes to power. I can tell you he wins elections. He, does it, quote unquote, legally. And then, of course, by the time he gains power in the Reichstag, the German parliament, by the time you get to 1938, he starts making all these claims for territory, for living space for the German people. So that between 1936 and 39, you have Germany expanding its influence here. Now, what will happen is that they really want to get this area of Poland right here to kind of take away this Danzig port. They reach that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which is highly unusual given that they're ideological enemies. But part of the reason why they sign it is that wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the Soviet Union gets to sweep through and take half of Poland as well. Now, whether or not Stalin thought that was a real legitimate non-aggression pact, whether he thought he was just buying time, historians debate that, and that's kind of beyond our purview here. But it kind of gives you an idea for the territory that we're talking about. So in the Pacific, Japan doing the same thing. And I want to emphasize to you, just simply because I don't want you to think it's too simple to say that it was all Hitler's fault and he was just the bad guy. Fascism looks a lot of ways. It behaves a lot of ways. Japan was just as territorially aggressive, and they do it earlier. By 1931, they're claiming control over Manchuria. Very shortly after that, they're claiming control of Korea. By 1937, they've invaded what is mainland China and committing acts of atrocities, including beheading contests, lining people up to see which officers can behead the most people. bashing babies' heads in, tying women up and raping them until they die, right? Impaling women on, you name it. Truly a level of horror and torture that, I would argue on par with what the Germans did. The difference being, right, the Germans kept records, so we knew. The Germans were very organized and efficient. Largely because for the Germans, it was all about tracking people and all this kind of stuff, right? For the Japanese, they see anybody not Japanese is so subhuman, they don't even have to worry about keeping up with how many of them they kill. It's not about acquiring property. It's not about acquiring territory. It's not about trying to extract resources from these people. The people that they murder, that they kill, that they rape, are not even really human beings. And therefore, there is no justification to keep records, okay? The other aspect of Japanese conquest in Southeast Asia is going to be the fact that, number one, they never have total control over China. You look at Germany, they get control over, Poland, over vast quantities of Europe, at least until you start to get to about 1942, 43. So they have a few years there where they can come up with their final solution and organize it and stuff like that. The Japanese don't quite have that quote-unquote luxury because they're fighting against the Chinese. Now, again, put a pin in this idea. It will be the nationalist Chinese that they're fighting against, not the communist Chinese. I'm sorry, reverse. It's the communist Chinese they're fighting against, not the nationalist. The nationalist Chinese will end up becoming they will eventually, after World War II, retreat into Taiwan. So when we talk about the Korean conflict, part of the problem going into the Korean conflict and the tensions with China and the Soviet Union around 47 and 48 is going to have to do with the fact that the U.S., who had basically shut the door on connections with China, when we decided to start paying attention about 1937, because mainland China has been invaded, we listened to Kai-shek of the nationalist Chinese, who is, nationalist in the sense of he's not part of the imperial family. It's a sort of kind of democratic, asterisk, not quite democratic, but sort of democratic regime. It's not a true imperial system, right? But then you have these communist Chinese who really kind of dominate in this region over here. So, we picked the wrong side, and that's the side that we send weapons and food to. And so it's the communist Chinese that are the ones that do the most effective fighting. And so when the war's over, that's who most of the peasants in China listen to, right? So all that to say that Japan never truly has a total handle on China. It takes them time to kind of move through that. And so there's a lot about what Japan is doing in China that is kind of putting out fires. So they never quite have a chance to create a systematic system by which they, or a system of murder, right, the way the Germans do. So very quickly they will extend after Pearl Harbor. You can see they get all the way almost into India. They get almost to Australia, right? They had actually begun, before Pearl Harbor, they had begun to take over Vietnam, what is French Indochina. They'd begun to push down into these areas right here. So Britain had a lot of concerns because they controlled Australia, this New Guinea area, all the way up into here, okay? So the anxiety that Britain has going into about 1939, 1940 is, oh my goodness, Japan's going to threaten us from that end, right? And, as we look at how Britain's being attacked, you'll recognize that they desperately had to keep these territories because that's where they were getting most of their food, right? Because Britain was under such attack. So essentially, what's going to happen is that you have these extreme ideas in Russia, in Italy, in Germany, some in Spain. Spain becomes a proxy war between communists and fascists. You have Japan, of course. And eventually what will happen is Italy, Japan, and Germany will unify together, ostensibly to keep an eye on the Soviet Union, because ideologically they're opposed, right? To kind of communicate this is an anti-Comintern pact. It eventually morphs into the Axis, right? As you start to have Germany expanding its control. So the issue that we have going on here is in 1930, the U.S. is isolationist, right? We want to focus on ourselves. We have a depression. We feel like we got kind of burned by World War I. In fact, you have congressional committees that are making the assertion that it was because of World War I that we even had this stupid Great Depression anyways, right? So they don't want to be involved. So you have passing the Neutrality Act of 1935 that says we are not going to sell weapons to any country that's at war. So if you're at war with somebody, we're not going to help you. Now, initially, in 1935, that's not such a big deal. Remember, Hitler's coming to power legally by winning elections. So it's not like he's having to march and fight people, okay? Stalin's only killing his own people, right? Japan has kind of, annexed Manchuria, but Manchuria is not putting up much of a defense, right? When it begins to change is with this proxy war in Spain. As Spain's going to war between communists and fascists and all that kind of stuff, and you have Soviet Union and Germany and Italy funneling money, funneling equipment into Spain, you do start to have the United States say, well, okay, if you're at war, then we can sell you non-military supplies, so food and blankets and that kind of thing on a cash and carry basis, okay? Now, part of this too, remember, you have a pesky little Roosevelt recession about 36, 37, so why not? If you're desperate for customers, sell non-military stuff. It's where you have somebody else doing the fighting, right? So a proxy war would be if I wanted you and Luke to fight, right? You guys are, one of you's communist, one of you's fascist. So Madison's going to control Luke, and I'm going to control you. And it's really Madison and I that are kind of crossways with each other, but we're using you as a proxy. If that makes sense.
So there's like your pawns.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
exactly.
who is fighting against Spain, or like what?
It's a civil war, technically. So what happens is you have an election that is contested, right? And you have three parties: one that's Democrat, one that's mostly kind of communist, socialist, and one that's fascist. And essentially, what happens is that the communist and the Democratic groups decide to kind of ally against the fascist group, which means that they end up having more votes, okay? And the fascist group gets mad, and they say, that's not fair, we should have had the most votes, blah, blah, blah. This is why third parties don't even work. And so you start having Germany and Italy funneling a bunch of supplies in to help the fascists, the phalangists is what they call them, to fight against the Democrat/communist elected government, coalition government, if you will. So we start stepping away from neutrality. Now, again, how much of this is because we're concerned about global affairs? How much of this is because our economy's contracted in the midst of a depression? Who knows, right? Historians have debated that multiple ways. The gist of it is, for our purposes, is that the U.S. is starting to take baby steps away from neutrality, okay, for whatever purpose. Now, for Roosevelt's purpose, he's never been a big fan of this whole isolationism thing anyways, okay? So for him, it makes a whole lot of sense, right? He believes in international cooperation, that you're less likely to go to war with somebody who's your customer. So that's kind of where he stands. However, he knows that the American public does not want war. The United States is highly divided about international action circa, 1938-39. You don't have a consensus, okay? People are concerned. There are definitely people concerned about the rise of Hitler. But then you've also got people that could care less. A lot of Americans are just trying to get through, trying to survive 1938, just trying to wait for things to turn around. So most people don't really care. And the people that do care are, kind of in the minority. So, FDR doesn't have a huge vocal support to kind of go after this kind of expansion of power by Germany and all that kind of stuff. Now, in 1937, FDR kind of uses a loophole to sell weapons to China. he says, well, technically China didn't declare war. They got invaded. So we can sell them weapons. Okay? So you start to have him pushing us closer and closer and closer. Come on. Hello. What are you doing? He starts pushing us closer and closer to the issues of getting involved in the war. That somehow my smartboard has gotten to where it doesn't stay formatted or aligned at all. Because I literally just did it earlier today. Yeah, I did. Anyway, so what's going to happen is that the U.S. begins to take these steps. So here in the U.S. in 1937 is sending weapons and aid to China. Now, we know that Pearl Harbor is Japan attacking the United States. So if you were Japan, would you claim that that was a very neutral action to take? No, you would not. And that neutrality continues to be a problem. In fact, you see from 1937 to 1941, American neutrality gets less and less, and we start really acting as a proxy for Great Britain to help protect Britain's interests in India and Australia. Okay, and so this is really kind of one of the things that helps push Pearl Harbor into happening. Now, I don't say that to make it sound like, oh, the Japanese were justified in attacking Pearl Harbor, because that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that the U.S. was engaged in a dangerous game, right, of not truly being neutral, but claiming neutrality, and it bit us in the butt. And, there's nothing wrong with saying that. I would argue that what you had was FDR trying to nudge the country to accept military engagement, and we'll kind of talk about the Atlantic Charter here in a minute. So what will happen is 1937-38, you have Hitler demanding territory, annexing Austria, annexing parts of Czechoslovakia, that sort of thing. 1939, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop contract, this is the non-aggression pact. And so in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland, okay? And Britain and France try to rush to Poland's aid. If we were a huge military class, we would talk about the failures and pros and cons of that. For our purposes, just know that they tried and they didn't quite get there, right? Within 2 weeks, it's very clear that Britain and France are not going to be able to do a whole lot. And so then, of course, here comes the Soviet Union sweeping into Poland, taking over the other half. And so you have Poland being taken over. Britain and France have declared war. So shortly after this, the U.S. says, oh, we really are neutral. We don't want to get involved in another European conflict. But FDR wants to do something to oppose Hitler, okay? He wants to kind of resist this. This goes back to kind of an agreement that he and Churchill had made back in 1936, kind of talking about the State Department had begun to be aware that some of the behavior might be a little problematic, okay? So what will happen in 1939 is we alter the Neutrality Act to say we can sell weapons to anybody, but on a cash and carry basis, and not on the U.S. won't do the shipping. You have to provide your own shipping. So again, baby step away. We're not selling anything to any countries at war. We'll sell non-military stuff to countries at war. Oh, China, we can sell weapons to because they're not really in war, right? To, we'll sell to whoever, but you have to pay cash and you have to provide your own shipping, okay? So again, that moving away very, very gradually away from neutrality. So 1939 happens. You have a period really going through for about 6 months, from late 39 to early 1940, where not a lot's happening in Europe, okay? But then in late spring, May, June of 1940, Hitler launches an invasion of France, sweeps through France. Very quickly, the British Expeditionary Force and the French forces kind of get pushed to a little area. You can't really see it very well, but it's this little tip of France that's really close to England. This is called Dunkirk, right? And they kind of, the troops get surrounded there. You have this massive rescue operation that involves just about any kind of ship that can sail across the English Channel, literally. But because they're using private ships, they can't bring the equipment. They're just rescuing people, right? And so Britain loses a ton of military equipment. And this is going to be a huge, huge problem for them. So part of what FDR wants to do in order to help Britain with its own shipping, right? Because one of the issues is, how are we going to get replacement weapons to Britain without distracting a bunch of our ships? So what does FDR do? He says, we can exchange destroyers, old destroyers that we're going to decommission anyways, for military bases to be named later, right? Kind of like your baseball trade or something like that. So essentially, that's what happens, this destroyers for bases deal. And so we get kind of this promise to build all these American naval bases on all these British-held territories in exchange for Britain being able to claim these destroyers and use these destroyers for shipping to bring military equipment back to England to replace what they've lost at Dunkirk with the invasion of France, right? And of course, this happens approximately September 1940, and this triggers an isolationist debate in the country. Now, the U.S. had been having an isolationist debate for some time, but it had been fairly quiet, right? But as you have the Neutrality Act of 1939, followed 6 months or so later by the Destroyers for Bases deal, your isolationists are really upset. And they even formed what is called an America First Committee, of whom some of them are Charles Lindbergh, our transatlantic flight guy, right? Got an Iron Cross from Hitler. Thought Hitler was an okay guy. I mean, he's turning Germany around, right? Henry Ford thought Hitler was turning Germany around. Make no mistake, there were businessmen and people in the United States that thought Hitler was doing a good thing. You had an American Nazi Party. You had an American Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden that portrayed a picture of Hitler and George Washington side by side in Madison Square Garden. You can Google it and pull up the picture. So that exists here. Remember, we got our own race problem. We've got our own sense of white superiority. Okay.
Did Hitler start by saying, like, let's kill all the Jews? Or did he...
Well, he started by saying, not let's kill all the Jews. That final solution comes later. What he starts with is saying that the reason that Germany lost World War I and has had to deal with all these ramifications from the Treaty of Versailles is because they were stabbed in the back by Jews. And that the Jewish ethnicity has damaged their genetic, material because it has weakened the Aryan race. That there's been too much intermarriage. So, again, it's this eugenics idea. It's, tied up into this kind of false biology that's really grounded on, American racism does the same thing with missignation, right? So it's the same concept. So it's a very familiar concept, but in Mein Kampf, he says it's all the Jews' fault that we lost World War I. The reason why our country has been weakened is because we've allowed intermarriage with weaker races and weaker ethnicities, including Jews, including Gypsies. We've allowed people that have disabilities to be around when they should be put out of their misery. That if we want to build the strong Aryan state, we need to focus on these Aryan traits, these Aryan qualities, and, be as tough as the Spartans were, on that kind of thing. So that's what he's arguing for. Now, people know this, right? Henry Ford is a notorious racist, an anti-Semite. Charles Lindbergh, same way. Now, Philip LaFollette's a progressive reformer who just doesn't like, his dad would have been an anti-imperialist, so that's where he kind of comes from. Same thing with Senator Nye. So not everybody buys into kind of that fascist ideology of white supremacy, but certainly it made for strange bedfellows, right? Where you have some people that are just like, we don't want to be engaged in the world's problems, circa George Washington and the farewell address, and then you've got people that are like, we think what Hitler's doing is great. So, and keep in mind, in the midst of the Great Depression, right, here's the United States struggling to figure out how to use the government in new ways with the New Deal. And in the meantime, Hitler has begun a massive turnaround of the German economy. Now, he's turned around the German economy because he's ignored the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles on military spending. So that's a massive infusion of cash into the economy. He's also stopped paying reparation payments, so that's money they get to keep. So he's doing some things that stimulate economic growth, and he's doing it within the construct of free enterprise. Because remember, fascism says private property ownership's cool as long as you're working with the state to make sure that you're making the stuff the state needs. Okay, so that's kind of the difference there. You do have a couple other groups. One of them wants to repeal all neutrality laws. Let's get involved right now. And then you've got the much larger group that was, okay, so maybe we need to get prepared. Maybe we should help Great Britain, but maybe we don't necessarily want to start fighting. Now, keep in mind that by 1941, by the end of 1940-41, you have the Battle for Britain, where the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is doing these bombing campaigns just continuously. And that has an escalation to it that goes from bombing, Air Force bases and stuff, because that was really all that was protecting England, right, was the fact that you had the Royal Air Force. So initially the Luftwaffe is targeting planes, but when that doesn't knock Britain out, they start targeting cities, and you start having civilian casualties. So this is part of that backstory that's going on with this isolationist debate. In addition, this isolationist debate is taking place during a presidential election year. FDR has already won 2 times, 1932, 1936. He chooses to run for a 3rd time, which is unprecedented. Now, it's not an amendment to the Constitution yet. The 22nd Amendment happens in 1952 or 3 or something like that. So it's not officially a part of the Constitution, but remember, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and how he comes back in 1912 and runs for what is essentially a 3rd term, and people thought that was really, oh my goodness, how shocking, right? Well, here's FDR, who legitimately, you could at least maybe argue that Teddy Roosevelt had won the vice presidency and then, ended up being president. FDR has won as president twice, and he's saying, wait a minute, we got too much else going on right now. We still are wrapping up this Great Depression, dealing with that. We've got, chaos happening around the globe. This is no time to change leadership. So he runs for a 3rd term. And he wins because most American people want stability. Now, there is a healthy critique that that's not legal. In fact, I have a button over there that's a reference to stealing 3rd base, basically stealing a 3rd term. And that's not to say that he has unanimous consent in Congress. He's still having to deal with conservatives and all that kind of stuff. But he's going to win pretty handily in 1940. But as he wins in 1940, he starts talking about things like the 4 freedoms, right? The 4 freedoms speech, in which he kind of outlines that the American duty is to protect the 4 freedoms around the globe. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Okay? You see these themes repeated over and over again as FDR is trying to convince the American public to support aid to Great Britain. You'll see these themes repeated over and over again as we're fighting in World War II. You'll see these themes repeated over and over again as we're coming out of World War II and establishing the United Nations. So this is essentially the mission statement for the United States in the second half of the 20th century. This is what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to aid and protect and expand democracy so that the whole world can have these core freedoms that we have. Okay? And so he gives this 4 freedoms speech, and he gives this about the same time that he gives his Arsenal of Democracy speech, which is around right about the time that he has his inaugural address. I can't remember if it's a little bit before, a little bit after. But basically, Britain is out of money, right? So, yeah, we gave them destroyers for bases in September 1940 so they could come pick up the equipment. But now, by December of 1940, they can't pay cash. So what are we going to do? And you have FDR give the speech that not only are we here to support the 4 freedoms, but we're here to be the arsenal for democracy. That we can make the weapons and the tools that Great Britain needs to fight. With the argument being, if your neighbor's house was on fire, wouldn't you loan them a garden hose until the fire department showed up? And so he makes this case, right? And so you have them beginning to have lend-lease aid, okay? Now, also, and I forgot to mention this, in May of 1940, May, June 1940, right as France has fallen to Germany. We also have a Selective Service Act. Okay, we start drafting soldiers. Passes by one vote. By one vote does the Congress authorize the Selective Service Act in order to start raising our forces. Now, the whole gist of all of this, between Selective Service Act and the Lend-Lease Act and Storage for Bases, is that that's going to bring an end to the Great Depression. So here we are in 1941, participating in this Lend-Lease Act. That means our factories are converting to production. People are going to work. You've got a certain number of men that are being put in the military. So they're getting a paycheck. They have a job. So people are taking the jobs that are left open or that are opening. And people are beginning to work in these defense industries and in the support industries that go into that. Okay? So this is what begins to turn around the economic situation of the Great Depression, is this Lend-Lease Act and all this kind of stuff. And of course, anybody who's fighting, alongside Great Britain will benefit from Lend-Lease aid. So you're talking about China, you're talking about the Soviet Union, you're talking about Great Britain, and any number of resistance movements that are taking place around the globe. Okay. So you have the United States taking very specific actions to aid Great Britain. Is that neutral?
No.
Yeah, I mean, the theory is, well, Lend-Lease is just to help people that are resisting oppression, but the people that are primarily resisting oppression are people in, Great Britain, right? The French resistance. By 1941, the Soviet Union.
So did this operate under like a we're being neutral?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, the claim was we are neutral. We are just simply standing up for democracy. We are not picking the side of any one country. We are just standing up for democratic countries, is the argument. Except, of course, the Soviet Union is not democratic. So I'm not sure how we solve it. But again, if you go back to the primary sources, the articles and the movie reels and the news reels from this time period, there's a lot of effort that goes into convincing the American people that everything we thought we knew about the Soviet Union and communism isn't correct, right?
In like a negative way or like
No, in a positive way. Oh, they're resisting and they, all this kind of stuff. And this was their form of self-government. And so we have to support that because the Soviet people chose communism as their form of government. Yeah. Of course, that's going to change completely when you get to 1947. I mean, So, again, playing a little fast and loose with these definitions. So next you have the Atlantic Charter, okay? So I'm going to kind of pass around this Atlantic Charter document. And we're going to kind of look at the Atlantic Charter, and you'll see it's really not all that neutral, okay? And again, this is happening approximately August 41, okay? So this is several months before Pearl Harbor. All right, so let's take a look at this. The Atlantic Charter, this is a joint declaration between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. First paragraph basically says that we have met together and we deem it right to make known certain common principles in the national policies of their respective countries on which they base their hopes for the future, for a better future for the world. So these are documents for the people in their country, okay? But it's also a statement to the world, the Declaration of Independence. You issue this to the people in your country to convince them, but you're also kind of making a stand outside your country. First, their countries seek no aggrandizement, territorial or other. That's a fancy way of saying we're not trying to make our countries bigger. We just want to, stand up for each other. Second, they desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Okay? So, hey, if there's a group of people that really want to be a part of the United States or Great Britain, okay, fine, whatever. Third, they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Okay? So they're making the argument that they believe in people choosing their form of government. As I mentioned, the Soviet Union chose communism, which, depending on who you're talking about, may have, right? Now, put a pin in that idea, because one of the primary documents from, I think it's chapter 24 in American Yacht that talks about World War II, is the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, okay, that we choose to not recognize after World War II. Fourth, they will endeavor, with due respect for their existing obligations, to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade, to the raw materials of the world, which are needed for their economic prosperity. So this is a trade statement. We believe in global trade, essentially. This is your first kind of real open declaration of globalization. Everything that happens after that, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, all have to do with global trade. It's not until Donald Trump becomes president that that begins to change. That's how significant Donald Trump's trade policies are. One of the lesser known details that we overlook. Fifth, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations and the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Right? So we're all going to work together to improve our economies. Again, globalization. Notice, August of 41. Sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in the lands they may live out their lives, that all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. So that for freedom of speech. Seventh, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. Free trade again. Eighth, they believe that all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression from outside their frontiers. They believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. So very familiar to the 14 points, right? Now let me ask you this. Is that a neutral statement?
No.
Why not?
Because they're essentially saying they're going to get involved, right? They're going to say, okay, we'll trade, but then that opens the question, well, who are you going to trade with?
Mm-hmm.
And if we get to pick that, then we're not neutral anymore.
Right. And if we're going to promote free seas, what can happen? Right? If we're trying to ship things to Great Britain and Germany sinks one of those ships, that violates this charter, doesn't it?
Right.
So, yeah, kind of interesting. Not so neutral, are we? Right? Now, what that little document doesn't say is that part of why that phrasing about the free seas is what it is because FDR's hoping that Germany will sink an American ship. And that we can say, oh, how dare they? We have to go to war against Germany. Okay? So, again, and I think it's important to recognize this, that FDR is hoping to trigger an event with Germany. That's where he sees the threat. He does not see the threat as coming from Japan. Remember, Japan is mostly being aggressive over here in China. And yes, Britain's getting a little bit nervous because they've taken over, what is now Vietnam. And they feel like that's a little too close to India. And they feel like they're kind of getting a little bit greedy over here. What if it drifts down to Australia? But fundamentally, both Britain and the United States are underestimating Japan. Which, if you think back to World War I and the Paris Peace Conference, that was true in 1918 as well, or 1919 as well. Where basically the European powers in the United States ignored any claims by Japan for them wanting to have territory, even though Japan had allied themselves with the United States and Great Britain. So
we understand that we're not neutral anymore. We're just
FDR understands.
Okay.
I think most of your State Department probably understands. Now, does your average person, you know, that's enjoying the fact they've got a job in a factory because of the Lend-Lease Act, do they know? Do they care? It's like everything. You'll have a subset of the population that's aware enough to go, we're not really behaving neutrally, right? And those people could be either, yay, we want to get involved, or, ooh, no, we don't want to get involved. But a lot of people are just going to kind of see it all as a preparedness measure and be happy they have jobs, right? Not that they want to get involved. They don't really want to get involved. But, hey, you know, it makes sense to be ready, doesn't it? So you have a lot of people kind of sitting in the middle. I do think it's fair to say, and this is where the accusation comes that FDR knew about the Pearl Harbor attack. It is fair to say that FDR understood that he was pushing neutrality, right? That here's the line and here's his toe, and he keeps, let me go a little bit farther over that, you know. I think it's pretty clear. And the State Department, to a different degree, has the same awareness. The State Department at this time is actually kind of a hot mess because there's a lot of anti-Semites in the State Department. In fact, the U.S. turns away Jewish refugees because we have those 1921 and 24 immigration quotas that say only 3% of the people that came over in 1900 or whatever, or 1907, are allowed to come in. Well, that means that people from, you know, Poland and Germany are having a hard time coming into the United States. And we do not, underscore, adjust our immigration policy at all. You have a few groups of people that are working to bring refugees in. They have some success. Britain primarily becomes the place where refugees are escaping to. But even that, if you know anything about the Kinder transports, those were heavily focused on rescuing kids, not necessarily rescuing adults, unless you had a lot of money or had a particular position within a government. So there's some complicated history to this. Not only are we not really being neutral, but we're also not really helping in a way that's not militaristic, that's not on behalf of Great Britain. In other words, this isn't just a humanitarian, oh, gee, we don't like the way people are treated, we want to reach out to people, okay? So all that to say, one of the interesting debates about our 21st century refugee situation and asylum seekers is that the implications of our actions in World War II and turning away Jewish refugees over and over and over again was that we began to loosen up our definition of refugee and asylum seekers, because we never wanted to get caught being this disgusting, right? But, you know, we're throwing all that out the window now anyways. So yes, that is the Atlantic Charter. So we're still simmering in 1941. Britain, who needs all the food and resources they can get from Australia and all the food and resources they can get from India, and need to have shipping coming up here through the Indian Ocean and all that kind of stuff, they are a little bit concerned about Japan. So, what are they going to do? They basically asked the United States to help them out. And so the U.S., and legitimately, because Japan has claimed territory in China, they've claimed territory in what is now Vietnam, they control Korea, right? They've behaved with territorial aggression, and by 1941, they are part of the Axis powers. So the United States can, with some degree of authenticity, begin an embargo of steel and oil. Now, why does that matter? Japan is not very big, and it's very rocky. Parts of it are volcanic ash, right? So they don't have the steel, the iron, the oil resources that the United States does. So they got a lot of their resources from the U.S. all throughout the teens, the 20s, the 30s, right? Remember, after 1850, they had rapidly industrialized, okay? So their territorial aggression, even if you look at, World War I, the whole reason for their territorial aggression and wanting to have more territory, having fought alongside the Allies, was because they were desperate for raw materials to make stuff. So by the time you get to the 1930s, they're like, screw it, they're never going to give us anything, we need to go take it. And so as that behavior starts to come down into Vietnam, you have the United States saying, well, wait a minute. We don't like how you're behaving. You're being too aggressive. We want you to take a step back. And so they begin to embargo strategic materials. Okay? And this pushes Japan into the alliance with Germany and Italy. Combined with the Lend-Lease aid to China. And then in July of 1941, we freeze Japanese assets inside the United States. So we freeze all their bank accounts, all that kind of stuff. This is a big deal. One of the things that happened when Trump kind of undid the sanctions against North Korea, those sanctions came from the Treasury Department. They were going to freeze assets. When we had sanctions against Iran, we froze assets, right? Basically, locking somebody's money up and saying you can't use it, right? So it has a huge impact. So Japan has decided, going really back, you could argue there was some discussion in 1939. Certainly planning really starts to kick off in 1940 once the embargo takes place. Japan begins to plan an attack against the United States. The idea being that the U.S. is not behaving neutrally. They're going to get involved eventually, right? It's just a matter of when. And rather than wait for them to get involved on their own terms, if we strike them and we strike them fast and hard, then maybe we can extend our influence as far as we possibly can and at the very least, keep hold of this territory that we've expanded to, and maybe even claim all the way into Australia, right? So the intent is to knock out as much of the Pacific Fleet as possible. They're not trying to attack the Atlantic side, only the Pacific side. They want to knock out as much as they possibly can. And they know Britain can't do anything. So it's really just the United States is the only group they have to deal with. So they're hoping to incapacitate us for 2 years. They play a negotiation game throughout 40 and 41. Oh, gee, please don't freeze our assets. We don't like that. Going, oh, we promise we'll behave. Lots of that back and forth. And so part of the accusation that FDR should have known was that we're not really behaving neutrally. And that he should have known that Japan was not negotiating in good faith. Now, what I would argue is that the U.S. just misreads the signals. I don't think the U.S. trusted Japan. I just think they had a fundamental lack of respect for their ability, right? Which they shouldn't have, because remember, Japan had kicked Russia's butt like in 1903. Teddy Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a peace agreement between Japan and Russia. So we know, and Japan had been an ally in World War I. We know they have military capability. We should have known better, but we didn't, right? We had that same racist assumption that created the Chinese Exclusion Act, created the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan that said you're not going to let a bunch of immigrants come into the country because we don't want Asian immigrants, right? And so we have this fundamental disrespect, and we basically don't recognize them as equals. So, yeah, we know they're not really negotiating in good faith, but, who knows? Right? So yes, Pearl Harbor was warned. We had an early radar system. They didn't know exactly how trustworthy it was, so they got a sign that there were planes coming towards Hawaii, and they said, oh, gee, we think something's coming this way. And a couple guys looked at it and said, oh, that's probably just geese or something. It's going to be birds. Planes wouldn't come that way. Right? Again, this fundamental assumption that, the Japanese couldn't launch an attack like that. Right? So, you have first wave. There's 3 waves planned. First wave comes up, hits airfields, Battleship Row. Second wave, Battleship Row, airfields. Then they've lost the element of surprise. In part, if you've ever seen the movie Pearl Harbor, which has a lot about it that is a little bit historically fuzzy, right? But there are a couple of pilots that get off the ground that shoot down some planes. You've got Dory Miller, who gets up to an anti-aircraft gun and shoots down some planes. And so the Japanese kind of go, oh my gosh, we've lost the element of surprise. We have to pull back. Okay, so they stop the third wave. Now, here's the ironic part to me. And this is a pattern of Japanese fighting that you see over and over again. The Japanese are obsessed with this idea of surprise attack. We surprised you and we've knocked you out, right? And I mean, this was their MO with the Russians in 1903. But what will happen is that had they done the third wave, they would have sunk more ships, right? And it would have made it harder for us to rebuild. But they don't. Same thing happens again in Midway. Same thing happens again in the Philippines. Over and over and over again, the Japanese make the same flawed decision. When they lose the element of surprise, they back off. And the Americans, being Americans, man, we'll run at that brick wall as many times as we got it. You know? We don't care. You know? And that becomes especially important when you talk about the Pacific Theater, because the Pacific Theater is nothing but islands. So when you're doing your web quest and you look at kind of the island hopping, that's what we're talking about. So every little bitty island, every little atoll, every little volcanic, mass that's floating around the Pacific, you have beach invasions. So if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, that is the big Normandy, D-Day, French invasion, okay? Understand that the Germans, they would have these pillboxes set up on these cliffs and they would fire down, but if you could get up and through those pillboxes, you could probably kind of get a base of operations. The Japanese would let Americans get all their equipment, and then they would attack them at night with a surprise attack, of course. And you would have vicious, vicious, vicious fighting, horrific fighting. And the Japanese, because of their military culture, more so than the Germans, did not allow surrender, right? In fact, when Americans and British surrender to the Japanese, they see them as subhuman, because only somebody who wasn't really human would surrender. You would prefer to die rather than surrender to your enemy. And this is the attitude that the Japanese have all throughout the Pacific Theater. So the Pacific Theater is particularly horrible when you're talking about fighting, not to mention the jungle conditions and all that kind of stuff. So very difficult to fight there. Not that it's a piece of cake in the European theater either, okay? But it's different. And we focus very much on the European theater, I would argue, first and foremost, because, well, they look kind of like us, right? So it feels more familiar. But also because later on, after the war's over, right, as we've dropped the atomic bomb on Japan, we kind of start, by the time we drop the atomic bomb on Japan, we know that tensions are building with the Soviet Union. So if the tensions are building with the Soviet Union, and Japan has this proximity to the Soviet Union, maybe we want to be nice, right? So we kind of have a little bit of historical amnesia about some of the things that happen in the Pacific. And it's kind of interesting, right? So more on that when we get to the Cold War. So yes, December 7th, 1941, this is the Pearl Harbor attack. You must know that date, kind of like you have to know October 1929. FDR gives his speech. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, is a day that will live in infamy. So the "You have nothing to fear but fear itself" is the Great Depression speech. The day of infamy is the World War II speech. And so he basically says we're going to declare war on Japan. A couple days after that, Germany declares war on the United States. So when we declare war on December 8th, it's only against Japan. It's not against Germany. At this juncture, remember, the isolationists, it's one thing to go to war with Japan because they attacked us. It's another thing to go to war with Germany. Except then Germany declares war on us because, right, they have attacked the Soviet Union. And they want Japan's help to help fight the Soviet Union. So, hey, we'll help attack the United States. Your enemy's our enemy, right? Now, Japan and Germany never really have a very effective working relationship. In other words, they basically fight in separate theaters. Cooperation is mostly on paper, not in practice. This becomes particularly true if you watch any kind of movie that has to do with China and the presence of the Japanese in China. There's a lot of Germans that will try to protect their Chinese workers, right? Shanghai and those areas had lots of Europeans, and so there were German factories in China, and they would work really, really hard to try to protect the Chinese from the Japanese, and the Japanese didn't really care. So kind of an interesting little tidbit there. There's the airfield. And my husband always tells me which ship this is. It's wrongfully attributed to one ship, and it's really another ship, but I never can remember which one because I'm not that much into military yet. Civilian casualties, right? And this is the extent of the Japanese forces at the end of 1941. So you can see they are pretty close to Australia. They are pretty close to India, all right? And all throughout here, they are capturing American and British forces, most notoriously in the Philippines, okay? They launched an attack on the Philippines by, I think, February of 42. They have conquered the Philippines. You have the American troops retreat to what is known as Corregidor. Douglas MacArthur, yes, Mr. Bonus Army, let's drive the World War I veterans out of Washington, D.C., Douglas MacArthur. He basically famously says, I shall return, right? And so he is forced, the FDR says, no, you have to leave. And so he leaves, you have to. I can't let a four-star general get captured by the Japanese. And so he leaves the Philippines, leaves it with a bunch of American troops who then run out of food and run out of ammunition and are left with no other choice but to surrender. And they are force marched from Bataan all up to a section of Luzon in the Philippines. And this is known as the Bataan Death March because, like I said, the Japanese saw people that surrendered as subhuman. And so they didn't give them food. They wouldn't let them stop for water. If they got weak, they would kill them. They wouldn't let them seek medical attention. They would march them to the point of exhaustion and commit all kinds of atrocities. So, again, I say this because don't think that it's just the Germans that commit atrocities. Japanese do too. In fact, the Americans do too, right? One of the things that we're going to talk about is that, pretty quickly, by February of 42, the U.S. military goes to FDR and they say, we want to declare a hemispheric, or we want to declare a defense zone, a military zone here along the West Coast, because we're concerned about that the Japanese might attack, and there's Japanese populations along here. Now, understand that the Japanese population was never that big. I mean, it's big enough. You're talking 300,000-400,000 people. Maybe it's 500,000, something like that. About 500,000 or a little less people. So it's enough people to notice, but it's not enough people that you can't identify them. Plus, physically, there's a difference in appearance. Now, the irony here is that most of the Japanese that get affected by this military zone are people who are American citizens. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt signs a gentleman's agreement with Japan that says we're going to limit immigration. So really, you hadn't had any fresh new immigration from Japan since the early 1900s. So those people that immigrated in the early 1900s, they're the grandparents. They're the ones that are the immigrants. And they're generally elderly. Now, they had kids, and their kids had kids. So you've got first and second generation Americans that were born in this country that are Japanese American in the truest sense of the word. And much like we saw with Mexican American deportation, there's not a whole lot of concern about that little hyphen, right? And so the military goes to FDR. They ask for Executive Order 9066. FDR signs this order. This is the Japanese American internment camps. Japanese Americans are given 2 weeks to get their affairs in order. So in 2 weeks, you have to figure out what you're going to do with your home, with your business, with your belongings, because you can't just pile up into a truck and move all your stuff to a particular location. They have barracks and they have camps that you essentially stay in, surrounded by barbed wire with armed guards. Now, granted, they're not rounding you up and putting you into showers that have poison gas. But you are not allowed to bring furniture. You're limited to how many pieces of luggage you can bring. I want to say it was it the whole family got like 4 or 5, and then each person could bring 2, something like that. So you're not talking a ton of luggage. You know, and suddenly you have to, if you own a house, who's going to take care of your house? You don't know how long you're going to be there, right?
What was like the condition? I mean, I guess like you just said that they don't know, but when
Of
they
the
signed
camps?
it, yeah. When would they let them loose?
Well, what do you mean? Like, when do they think they're going to be let loose?
Yeah. Or like
They don't know. Like, in other words, when Executive Order 9066 happens, let's see. Fiddlesticks. Really, dude? Okay, there we go. So, if you go to some images. What? No. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Japanese American internment camp. All right. All right, so this kind of gives you an idea. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. There's another one. So what happens is they don't know how long it's going to be. The actual order, let's see if I can find a picture of the order. Here we go. The actual order just simply said, that you're going to be moved to designated areas, right? So they get 2 weeks to figure out what they're doing. Obviously, if you own a home, you have to either find somebody that can take care of it. You hope it's somebody you can trust, or you have to sell it, which means people are probably going to not pay you top dollar for it because they know you have to sell it. If you have a business, you have to shut down your business or find somebody to take care of it. You have to do the same thing with your furniture, with your heirlooms. You leave your job. Like, you don't know when you're coming back.
What happens if like you don't? Like if you just like leave your
They would arrest you
good try.
and throw you in jail. And that's the thing. Japanese Americans comply. They comply with the order. What they start to do is fight it in the courts. So they start fighting and they say, wait a minute, this is a violation of due process. I haven't been accused of a crime. There's no evidence. There's, blah, blah, blah. This is unfair confiscation of property, so forth and so on. And initially, there's a ruling called Korematsu. And in Korematsu, the Supreme Court rules that, well, in times of war, the government can do extraordinary things, right? Extraordinary. In times of war, they can, and we'll talk about this with how you start having the government setting production quotas and wage controls. And so all those things that the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the NRA did, that the Supreme Court said, oh no, the government shouldn't get involved in that stuff. Now, because we're at war, they're going to say, yes, that's okay. You can do these things. And that includes the Japanese internment camps. And so they round everybody up, and they take them on a bus, and they put them on a train. And you have camps, many of them in California, many of them kind of in the interior. You've got a few around Arkansas, and they force them to stay in these camps. And over time, they start suing, and there's a couple of subsequent lawsuits. One of them says, if I've been proven innocent, I should be able to go get a job. So you have a few of them start to get a job. You start to have the Japanese Americans, make the case that they want to serve in the military. So you end up having a group of Japanese Americans that serve in the military. And serve with distinction, right? There's never any proof of any collusion, of any kind of attempt to help the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. I mean, they suspect that there had been some Japanese tourists that weren't really tourists, but those were people that came from Japan. Those weren't Japanese Americans, right? And so there's kind of this assertion that, that this is what's going on. And so Japanese Americans get rounded up, and it's kind of a dark spot on the United States, right? Because we rounded these people up, and then sat there and claimed the high horse when it came to other groups, And no, we weren't gassing people, right? But we did cause people to lose life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness because we were concerned, right? After Pearl Harbor, As the Japanese are expanding their control into 1942, get control of the Philippines, by like April of 42, you have a thing called the Doolittle Raid. So if you've ever watched the movie Pearl Harbor, this is where the movie Pearl Harbor ends. That is a dramatized true account. You do have an attempt by the United States to kind of strike at Japan to remind them that, hey, we're not out. And so we do. We modify long-range bombers, and we drop some bombs on Tokyo, end up crashing the planes in China and rescuing our pilots out of there. What that does, though, is it stops the Japanese. So if you go back to kind of this idea of the extent of Japanese, the extent of Japanese control, that makes Japan stop expanding. So they could have kept expanding while the U.S. was, after we had hit Tokyo, they could have pushed farther into India, into Australia, but because we strike Tokyo, Japan goes, oh, we've lost the element of surprise. So we're going to dig in where we're at. Now, the bad side is that means they're really dug in. So by the time the American troops are island hopping through the Pacific, we're having to really root out the Japanese who are dug in. But it stops the expansion of Japan and what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is a fancy term for Japanese territory. And so you kind of have this the Doolittle Raid happening. By the time you get to the summer of 42, you have the Battle of Midway, and that starts the United States pushing back, slowly, pushing the Japanese, right? And so everything we're doing, the island hopping campaign, you've got the Navy island hopping, you've got the Army pushing up to the Philippines, so you've got the Philippine campaign, all of this coming to a head in Japan in 1945. However, the closer we get to Japan, the higher the casualty rates. So that by the time you get to the Battle of Okinawa, we lose like 12,000 soldiers. So we'll talk in a little more detail about the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Just know that fighting in the Pacific was horrid. It was horrid. It was so bad. And we kept, with every inch we got closer to Japan, the more people we lost. So when Truman's making the decision to drop that atomic bomb, that's part of what's happening. And Japanese trained every citizen to fight. There are pictures of little kids. My husband showed me this the other day. I'll have to email it to myself and show it to you. Of American soldiers trying to communicate with two little boys, Japanese little boys who are probably 7 or 8, who are dressed like soldiers, right? Because the Imperial Japan had told men, women, children, be prepared to fight. They had stockpiles of guns. They had stockpiles of planes. So the Japanese had no intent of just surrendering because, oh, well, hey, the Americans are on Japan, right? It takes dropping 2 atomic bombs to force them to surrender. Even after the first one, they didn't want to surrender. And so you have, and they were going to let everyone die because the idea was no one surrenders. And if you surrender, you're not human. So little children, women, sharpened bamboo spears. Can you imagine American troops trying to fight against little kids with sharpened bamboo spears? So this is the context in which the Pacific fighting takes place. Really, really horrific, right? Now, again, that doesn't really, you've got the whole European theater that's not much fun either, right? The European theater that's, starts with the North Africa campaign in 1942-43, pushes up into Italy like the interactive map showed you. But it's not until June of 1944 when we have the D-Day invasion that you really begin to see the European front change. But in the midst of all of this, you've got strategic bombing, these massive bombing campaigns that are killing thousands and thousands of civilians throughout Germany. You've got the Russians who do horrible things to people, right? So there's a reason why the Germans wanted to surrender to the Americans and to the British, not to the Russians. Because the Russians would literally rape every German woman they could find because they were mad. They were like, you invaded the Soviet Union, how dare you, right? So lots of violence going on in Germany. and so you kind of you have the Battle of the Bulge. I think that's one of them. I think I put it on there. That one's kind of the last gasp of the Germans. So lots of little details like that are kind of interesting. So next, like I said, I won't see you on Wednesday. You'll have a chance to work on your web quest or whatever. And then on Friday, we'll talk about the home front and kind of how we built up our forces and converted our economy. And then we'll move on, right? So not a whole lot of time for World War II. So if you have a specific question, I would strongly suggest you directly ask me, so that way I know what to ask or what to answer. And let's see what else. So, and then next week we'll start talking about the Cold War. We'll kind of pick up with the last conferences, kind of run through what the conferences were all about. So any questions? That was fast and furious. No, we didn't really do anything. This class talked a little bit about communism versus fascism, but we chased a lot of rabbits. And then my other classes, we didn't get anything done.